A superhuman is someone who is self-aware and who cultivates their natural self. Each one of us are gifted with our unique observations, inclinations, and curiosities in life. The goal of the Superhuman Project is to help professionals become the best version of themselves and realize their full potential, to honor our natural selves. In each episode, I invite professionals at the top of their field and ask them questions about their quest for self-awareness. What makes them successful and how do they stay at the top of their game? Ultimately, it is about living a life we always wanted to live and not letting other people define it for us. Making sure we fulfill the potential that God has given us and we are living our best selves. Let's jump in. Cool. So, I'm very excited today. I have my guest, Zachary First, who is an executive director at the Peter Drucker Institute. And Peter Drucker is someone I call him my guru. He is a management guru. And I think he has written so much about business management and personal effectiveness, that the kind of things he has written, they are timeless. I have written his book, especially The Effective Executive, many times, and I keep it by my bedside all the time. And every time I hear it on my Audible or I read it, I find some new insights. And Zachary was gracious enough to give us his time, and I want to talk to him about his impression of Peter Drucker. I want to talk to him about what he is doing in terms of spreading the knowledge of Peter Drucker through Drucker Institute. And so, Zach, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Amul. It's good to be with you today. I am not a person who was born or grew up thinking that I was one day going to work at the Drucker Institute. It didn't exist until about 20 years ago. And it's a strange experience to work at an organization that is dedicated to the teachings of one person. We can find a very few examples of that these days. Most people live in and work for large organizations, and you may find the occasional dominant, mostly in technology, the kind of dominant CEO personality. But for the most part, it's an unusual experience. And so it was a commitment that I considered pretty carefully, because I wasn't sure at first, is this something I'm ready to do, to go dedicate my professional career to one person's thinking? And of course, as so often happens with people like myself and yourself and many others, you crack open that first Drucker book, whatever it is, you start reading. One of the first things I thought to myself was, well, this all just sounds like common sense. How did this guy become famous? And then I came to understand it's common sense mostly because people are following the path that he's laid out. That's how it became common sense. People didn't understand these things for the most part until he spelled them out and made them explicit in terms of principles of management, how organizations and individuals perform, and what management is really for. So I got hooked about 15 years ago when I was considering coming to work for the Institute as one of its first two employees. And since then, have really savored the opportunity to get to know this man through his work. Of course, he passed away in 2005, 2 years before I came out to California to work here. So I've never met him personally. I've met plenty of people who knew him very well, but I never did. So I had to get to know him through the pages of his books and the articles he wrote, through the legacy of the relationships that he left behind, through the way in which he set us up as an organization. All of these different things reflected who he was and how he viewed the world. And probably the most subtle point that it took me the longest to grasp, what I've come to understand is the single most important thing to know about him, is that Drucker wasn't born thinking that he wanted to become a management guru. Of course, there were no management gurus at the time he was born. There was no such thing. He fell in love with the field of management and spent much of his career writing about it, because he believed that management served the ultimate purpose, which was to ensure the strength and the health of human society. That was really what he cared about. So he chose management because it was an instrument to create healthy organizations and a strong society. And understanding that in the end, Drucker was really a person who cared about people and who cared about society and who cared about making life bearable and fulfilling as much as possible is kind of the key to understanding what everything is that he has to say about management.
Yeah, yeah. That's very helpful and a very insightful introduction. So one thing for our listeners who are not aware of who Peter Drucker is, and I believe Peter Drucker is someone who coined the term knowledge worker. So most of us, even before when I would say computers were not invented for personal use, he was the one who created this term knowledge worker. And I really love his analogy about comparing a knowledge worker with a factory worker. And he talked about that you can measure in his book, The Effective Executive. He talks about that you can measure the output of a factory worker by the number of goods he makes in a particular shift. Yes. But in order to measure the outcome of a knowledge worker, he laid out the metrics in terms of it's not just the number of goods. In terms of knowledge worker, he talked about the impact or the output that a knowledge worker drives, which was very, very insightful, or maybe way ahead of its time, what he talked about.
Yes.
And
it sure was.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sure was. He coined that term knowledge work in 1957. So, 30 years or so before the average family had a computer or even access to a computer. And it's exactly as you say. He understood that the industrial worker was one where you could measure piecework. You could figure out how many units of output per units of input. And it was inherent to management in that kind of industrial system that the manager typically got promoted to the position of management because they knew best how to do each job in the factory. So the manager was the expert in each task. So wherever you were working on the assembly line or within the organization, your manager knew often more about how to do your job than you did, and you would look to the manager as the expert. In knowledge work, that equation gets completely flipped on its head. The manager in a knowledge organization always knows less than the employee about how to do their job. The employee is the expert in how to do what they do. And the manager's task is not to tell them how to do their job. It's to ensure that their contributions are all coordinated. And as you said, now we have this new word from Drucker that arises with knowledge work around contribution. Now, a knowledge worker's contribution can't be measured in terms of quantity. It may be measurable in terms of quality, although quality is a very difficult thing to measure, right? But you could say, well, one great idea is worth infinitely more than 1,000 days of showing up at the right time and clocking out at the right time. If you're a knowledge worker, you can sit at your desk all day long doing things and make no contribution as a knowledge worker. And you can have one brilliant idea and make an incredible contribution to an organization. And so the nature of knowledge work is completely the inverse of what we conventionally thought of as the way organizations operate. And as he saw from that change, everything else must follow in terms of how we run our management operation, how we measure organizations and the performance of management and individual workers. That change affects everything about how we work and live.
Yeah, and I think still businesses, I'm switching gears here. Still, businesses are trying to find ways to incorporate Drucker's philosophies fully in today's era still. Because if you talk about the effectiveness of an employee, that is a subject that everybody is trying to figure out, and especially in a working remote era. How do you advise businesses or CEOs? How do they measure effectiveness of their employees?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And of course, one of the things that makes Drucker's work so valuable is he understood that management is not primarily a technical field. It's primarily a humanistic field. The challenges for managers are about understanding what it means to be a human being, what motivates people, what frustrates people, why people will take risks, why they may not when you wish they would. These are all questions of psychology and morality and anthropology. He drew on all these disciplines. And so the question of, how do we assess a knowledge worker, especially in an era when now coming through a pandemic, everyone's been working remotely. You hardly ever see your colleagues anymore. How do we know people are doing the right things? Well, in some ways, those are timeless questions. How does an organization learn to trust its people? What are the limits of trust that it can place in its people? What do people do when they're given trust? Does it excite them and motivate them, or do they feel fearful by what they've been asked to do? These are very old questions. They may be new in our current context, but they've been around forever. So managers' tasks these days begin actually not with a technical question of what's the right way to monitor performance when everyone's working digitally. That's kind of the last question you want to ask at the end of a very long chain. The start of the chain is, what is the culture of your organization? How do people experience trust? Do they trust each other? Do you trust your employees? Do they trust you? How do you know? What do you do? What can you achieve if you have a high trust environment? What can't you achieve if you have a low trust environment? What kind of change do you want to make? Are you happy with where you are? Do you wish that you had more trust in your employees? Do you think they've been given too much license? After you ask all these questions and you think through how your organization really operates, you can then get down to the more technical questions of how do we monitor work and performance and make sure that employees are getting the resources and support they need and the accountability they need. But those questions are at the end of the chain. So there are some organizations today that probably think of themselves as knowledge organizations because they're digitally based, but they're really the modern equivalent of a factory. People are doing work where there's a certain number of outputs every day or every hour that's expected of you, and you get paid more or less depending on the pace at which you produce those outputs. In some cases, that structure even applies to people writing software code now. A job that we didn't used to think of as being like that. Now there are some people working in those kinds of environments. So there you could probably use a pretty traditional industrial system to monitor their work. And I'm sure most of those employees are subject to that. It's not a very fun way to work, but it's how that gets structured. But if you're not in that kind of environment, whether you're remote or in person, you still have the same core set of questions. How do employees know whether they're making a valuable contribution? And then how does the organization measure and reward those contributions? Those are always hard questions. There is no perfect answer to that. They are always difficult, important to work on constantly because your people are changing, your organization and work are changing. But in some ways, it's a red herring to think about the pandemic, right? Those questions were hard to answer before the pandemic. It just seemed easier because you could see whether someone was at their desk, and we kind of imagined that that was valuable information. It turns out it wasn't particularly valuable back then. It's not particularly valuable now for knowledge work. For knowledge work, it just doesn't happen that way. And so what's really happened is we've been forced to confront that fact. We've been forced to confront that we don't know based on these easy indicators whether a knowledge worker is productive. I don't know whether you're getting more done in 10 hours at your desk than your neighbor is getting done at 4 hours at their desk. I have no idea. I have to go find out what you're doing, right? And I have to help you make sure that what you do contributes to what the organization is trying to achieve. You could be producing a lot of stuff and not actually be driving the business. So the manager's job is to help employees also make sure that they know how their work contributes to the larger goals of the team and the organization.
Yeah. So in fact, that's what I was planning to ask you in terms of whose job it is. So, I think industrial work was very easy to measure. If I go to a shop floor or in a factory, I punch in, and at the end of the shift, I can count, okay, how many, whatever the factory is making, how many goods were produced. But as a knowledge worker, I think there is a lot of responsibility on me as a knowledge worker and my manager, in terms of figuring out the kind of impact I am making. So can you share some insights on the role of a manager in that scenario. What should a manager do versus what should a knowledge worker be doing to pick and choose or highlight the kind of impact he or she is making?
Yeah. So a manager's job, in simplest terms, is to get the best contribution from each employee. Now, there's a lot that's involved in that. That means a manager has to know what each employee is capable of. People have different strengths. They can do different things, right? Some people in a typical business, someone's a great presenter, someone else is a great analyst, someone else is a great connector and has great social relationships. Each person's contribution is different. So the manager's job, as Drucker said, is to make strengths productive and weaknesses irrelevant. The whole purpose of having a team is so that not everybody has to do the same thing. People can play to their strengths. That's why you have a team. If you're an individual, you don't have a choice. You have to do everything. But if you're on a team, you can do what you do best and let your colleagues do what they do best. And the manager's job is to make sure that all those contributions add up to the larger goal. Now you can look at, even if we take factory work as an example, the revolution that Toyota instigated through its Toyota production system was to recognize that even a manufacturing assembly line can be turned into knowledge work. And Toyota realized that you can actually ask employees on the assembly line to participate in the managerial activity of maximizing the effectiveness of the production line. And so every employee on a Toyota production line is tasked with, they are required to help make improvements in the assembly and manufacturing processes, which means they all work different stations. They have problem solving. They have like a big board basically that sits behind each section of the assembly line where they do problem solving around different tasks. Could we make this task more efficient? Could we make it more reliable? Could we reduce our injury rate? And they share ideas about how they might make those improvements. And eventually those improvements lead to changes in the tooling and the assembly line process. Every employee has what's called the andon, which is the cord you can pull that stops the entire assembly line. So every employee is entrusted with an incredible dollar value decision. When you shut down the assembly line in an auto plant, it's millions of dollars a day. And those employees, every one of them can pull that cord at any moment, stop the entire line, because they are trusted to have the judgment to know someone's safety is at risk, or there's a product about to roll off the line that's not safe. And lots of other companies have adopted this system. Herman Miller, which makes the Aeron chair, which lots of workers sit on in their offices, they adopted that system on their line, and they discovered one of their first challenges was in hiring, that they said, we actually want workers to bring not only their hands, but also their heads. And a lot of manufacturing workers weren't used to that. They didn't want to bring their heads to work. They wanted to just do work, clock out at the end of the day and go home. They said, no, we actually need both. So the modern knowledge organization is just that, even more so. You need every worker to exercise judgment around their task, because again, they understand what they're doing typically better than their manager does. You want workers to understand how their task contributes to the whole, to see the fullness of what the team is trying to achieve and know how to maximize their contribution. The manager's job is to ensure that all of those things happen, which means the manager has to know their people. They have to know their strengths. They have to know their weaknesses. They have to know their ambitions and their aspirations. They have to know their fears and their anxieties. The manager has to understand all those things so that each employee can be engaged to the best of their ability.
That's great. And I remember that while you were talking about a good manager, what kind of data he should have on his team, I remember something in The Effective Executive, what Peter Drucker wrote about what would be the function of a leader in this case.
Yes,
so
right.
How would a leader activate or mobilize a knowledge organization?
Right. So the leader's job, as you noted, Drucker wrote a bit about the unique task of the leader, especially in a knowledge organization. The leader's job is not to give orders in a knowledge organization. That's really not how knowledge organizations work. In fact, knowledge workers tend to resent when they're ordered around. They don't like that. The leader's job is to focus on what the leader can see and understand and influence uniquely. And those things are very importantly, what Drucker called the meaningful outside. So when you're on the inside of a very large organization, the organization becomes your whole life. So you go to work every day and you think about your company, its goals, its performance, your job, your colleagues, and that starts to feel like the entire world is actually just what you experience inside your company. And as Drucker said, the leader is uniquely able to see what's outside the company, your competitors, your partners, your customers, your country, its government, the global context in which you operate. And that is really where your results are as a company. They're only ever on the outside. They're in the value you create for your customers, in the way that you operate within the communities where you exist. That's what he called the meaningful outside. So one of the leader's most important jobs is to bring the meaningful outside inside the company. Help all the employees who are busy every day with the inside reality connect with what goes on outside the company. So famously, one of the executives who did this really well was a longtime chairman and CEO of Procter & Gamble, A.G. Lafley. A.G. made a point every time he traveled anywhere, and he traveled probably 200 or 250 days a year. It's a global company. Every time he traveled anywhere, he always had a requirement. Each day he did a home visit. So he would do a home visit with a mom using Procter & Gamble products. And he would talk to her about her experience, washing laundry, brushing the kids' teeth, changing diapers, whatever it was she was doing, putting on makeup, all the products P&G makes, as a way of emphasizing for employees, if I can do it, you can do it too. The outside world is what matters. Even as busy as I am, I make time to go see how people use our products and what difference it makes to them. So there's an example of a way that a CEO would do that. And then he could bring those stories back into the company after he did home visits in 80 countries around the world, right? He saw a lot. So that's a famous example of that. The other thing the leader can do is to really care for the culture and values of the company. So culture often feels like something that never changes. It's just kind of, it lands on you the day you start work and it's with you every day thereafter. Culture is always like everything in a community and any organization. It's always evolving. You can let it evolve on its own, or you can try to manage that evolution. And the leader's job is also to care for the culture and values of the company. What are the values that we hold most precious, the aspects of the culture that are most important? How do we feed those and help them grow and strengthen? What are all the things we're doing internally in this company to reaffirm those values? And how do we make sure that we're not getting distracted from those values? That some of the things we do day to day aren't out of alignment with those values. That's the leader's job more than anything else. So those are unique things the leader can do that the line worker, we want the line worker to think about them, but they don't typically have a role that lends itself to that. That's really where you want leaders to focus.
That's great. And then moving on, since the goal of the Superhuman Project podcast is to help individuals become self-aware, know their strengths, and become the best version of themselves. What's your advice from Peter Drucker in terms of today's knowledge worker? And I know a lot of people now, since offices are opening up, I read in news like people are not willing to go back to the office. Yeah. So what's your advice in terms of in terms of path to self-awareness? I know you and I spoke about some of the tools that are available, but at the same time, in terms of being effective, like time management, email management, there could be various things. But what's your advice for a knowledge worker to be effective in today's era?
Right. So you'll hear me in all my responses. I always start based on Drucker's philosophy. Start with what you shouldn't do, and then I'll talk about what you should do. And that was a very intentional guidance on his part. So the things you should not do are spend a lot of time trying to solve little problems or fix little process issues. So, if I want to make sure I have the cleanest desk, the shortest inbox, all these tasks, it's very easy to think about. I can measure my success. right? Or failure on those tasks. Very easy to see. It can be satisfying each day to take care of them. And you can get absolutely nothing done in the process of achieving all those things. So the first thing Drucker would say is, before you get to any of that, understand how you as an individual perform. How is it that you produce results? Where are your unique strengths? What are you good at? What are you not good at? And what you, and by the way, the list of things you're good at should be relatively short, and the list of things you're not good at should be relatively long. That's how people are built. There are a few things you're good at, and there are many, many things that you're not good at. And the job then of the knowledge worker, as he said, is to identify those strengths, the things you're good at, develop them. So figure out what you can learn, what skills you can acquire, what experiences you can engage in that will help you get better and better and better in areas where you're already strong, and figure out how do you align your strengths with the organization where you work. Once you've answered those questions, you may get to correcting some deficiencies. Maybe you have a couple of things you're not good at and you think, I really have to get, I'm never going to be great, but I have to just not be bad in order to get by in professional life. That's okay. You can do a little bit of work on that, but otherwise focus on your strengths. And then of course, there's no such thing as a strength in its own right, or being good at something in its own right. Question always is good for what? And that's where I think the pandemic has really expanded how people think about answers to that question. Because now all of a sudden people have understood, maybe the way that I perform, the way that I produce results is best actually not sitting at a desk every day. It's best not commuting to an office every day. Or conversely, you may discover, I kind of need that commute time. I need some quiet downtime by myself between home and work, when I can think about what I'm doing. I can decompress on the way home and I can recompress on the way to work. We all now are having to engage that question with a much wider set of possible answers to how we work, how we perform, what kind of organization we want to be a part of. So we see now there's a lot of people hunkered down during the pandemic, worried for lots of good reasons. And now there's an explosion of media coverage of an epidemic of quitting. Workers are leaving their employers. Now, in part, it's a tight labor market, so it's a great time to leave if you want a new job. But it's also because people have realized, I don't think I actually like that employer. And in fact, I dislike that employer so much that I would rather go into the unknown of unemployment and go make my own way or take a new job than stick around at a place that doesn't let me contribute and be my best self. So people are implicitly understanding this. You can see a lot of employees talking this way in the news coverage that you read about understanding, I'm not at my best working in that system. The manager's job is to spot those misalignments and try to either fix them, get someone better positioned within the organization to do their best work, or help counsel that person out. They're never going to be happy. And in fact, they're going to be a drag on the organization if they can't ever be in alignment. So that's where you want to start with your strengths. As you noted, well, there's lots of tools out there in the world for understanding what your strengths are, how you perform. Drucker talks about keeping a time journal where just, you can actually write kind of minute by minute. And in some cases, some people use software that does this for you. What am I doing at every minute of the day? Do that for a week and look back and see, where's my time going? Time's your most precious resource. What am I spending it on? Am I spending it on the things that are actually important in my work, or am I spending them on other tasks? You can write down a list of important decisions that you're making. Then he said, set it aside and come back to it 6 months later and assess yourself. How did I make that decision? Am I happy with the decision I made? What were the results? Would I do it differently next time? Start to be reflective for yourself about what you might want to do. There are wonderful psychometric tools you can use. I really like Standout as a tool from Marcus Buckingham. Standout is a great tool. It's based very much on Drucker's principles to understand how you perform, what your greatest value is within an organization or team. Lots of great ways to do that.
Perfect. This is really good. So, continuing that conversation on personal effectiveness, what's your advice on calendar management, email, given that, especially knowledge workers, like there is no clear boundary between work or office and home. So you are either
Yes.
all the time at home and all the time in office. So how
Yes.
do you define? It's very difficult to define, and everyone has their own approach in terms of finding time for meetings, answering emails, or even just taking out time for self reflection and learning something new. What's your advice there?
Yeah. 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 It's such a perennial question and such a hard one, with how connected we all are. And part of the way we at the Drucker Institute look at this, is it's very challenging for an individual employee to fight what is implied by organizations where they begin with this question, but the entire game isn't where you start. So if you begin with your work day, all your meetings and your hundreds of emails and all the rest that washes over you, that's a given. And now I'm trying to figure out as an employee, how do I better manage the rest of the day in order to feel a sense of balance? You've already given up the game. The problem, as Drucker said, is that about 2/3 of the time that employees spend in a typical organization is spent on tasks that nobody would miss if they were canceled. And so the first question you want to ask is, how can I bring more open space or less structure to my work day? How can I make that happen? One of the things I think has probably happened for a lot of companies through the pandemic is they've discovered there were a whole bunch of standing meetings that were actually worse than useless. They were net negative because they were using a lot of time and they weren't actually driving work. They weren't serving any crucial function. There were lots of small things that happened that can add up. The default is an hour on the calendar apps most people use. So most meetings default to an hour. And then, some organizations realize, well, we have all this precise control now with Zoom or BlueJeans or whatever the platform is. So they could start tweaking it and they would say, well, let's change the default to 55 minutes or to 50 minutes, or let's change the default to 25 minutes. And it turns out the meeting will happen in however much time you give it, which means you could just give it less time and the conversation will go wherever it needs to go and it'll be done. You can let people get back to their jobs. And so if you can actually recover a couple of hours in your day, well, then the whole work-life balance question becomes a lot less difficult to deal with, because now your employer has actually gotten out of your way a little bit. In some cases, that's a conversation for an employee with their manager about how the team structures its time. Some cases you have enough control over your own time that you can just say, I'm going to stop asking all those people to meet with me all the time. I'm going to make for fewer meetings. This meeting could have been an email. This meeting could have been a memo. This meeting could have been nothing at all. So, you can sometimes exercise your own control over that. But recovering time then lets you have a richer set of answers to this question about work-life balance. Because the inherent challenge for knowledge workers is your job's never really over because it doesn't live in the factory, it lives in your own head. And so wherever you are and whatever you're doing, you can think about work if you want to. If you build cars on an assembly line, you can't just start building a car. You have to be at work. If you're a knowledge worker, you can always, if you're in sales, you can always be thinking about your clients. You can always be thinking about how you do your CRM and what you might want to try next quarter. And all those thoughts can be with you. So the first thing you need to do is make more of your time available at work to do what you need to do. And then free your mind up to think about work at leisure. Every knowledge worker, if they're in a good knowledge job that engages them, will probably want to think about work from time to time, even when they're, quote, not at work. There should be something about your work that's interesting. And so that's okay. You want to give yourself permission to do that, but only if you've cracked the 9 to 5 problem first, which is your time well spent during the work day? If your time is not well spent during the work day, then no amount of adjustments you can do at home are going to be helpful.
So let's dissect this more. Like you said, create less structure in your workday, more open spaces. How would you do that? Because when I talk to some individuals, I get this response that sometimes, like, it's the culture of the organization. You are invited, you have to attend those meetings.
Correct. That's right.
So it's very difficult to go against the culture and push back. So my question is, how do you create that step by step approach to cleaning your calendar and freeing your time so that you can be more productive with your workday?
Right. And you're absolutely right. Lots of organizations will tell you, this is how we operate. This is what you need to do. And it's not up to you to decide, I'm going to completely change how I operate. It's not my choice not to attend those 10 hours of meetings every week. In which case, the decision you have to make is, first, you have to understand what is within your sphere of control. And it may be that you're in an organization where almost nothing is in your sphere of control, in which case your only decision really is either to surrender or exit. And to be clear, that is where a lot of workers are. It is for many workers, including in knowledge organizations, their job satisfaction is actually quite poor. Something like 20% of workers report, at least as recently as a couple of years ago, reported that they were engaged in active sabotage of their employers, actively consuming company resources, not because they needed them, but just because they resent the organization. They just want to kind of screw the organization over. So let's spend more on food, let's spend more on travel, let's throw out a bunch of paper, whatever it is. So let's be clear, a lot of organizations are not doing well at all and have not left employees with very much discretion. But to the extent you have any discretion, as a knowledge worker, you can take it upon yourself to talk with your manager to try to understand, what is it that I do that is of greatest value? And what is it that I do currently that is of lesser value? And maybe there's a few items on the lesser value list that you say, well, can I just stop doing those sometimes or even entirely? You may discover you have a manager who will tell you, I don't really care what times you're at your desk. That's your own choice. Here's what I do care about. So now suddenly you have some flexibility. Or you have a manager who says, I don't care what's happening in your life. Your butt's in that seat from 8:30 in the morning till 6 o'clock at night. So now you know, well, that's not negotiable. What happens in between those hours that I might be able to work with? So there are lots of ways in which you can try to pick and choose your opportunities to say, do I need to be at that standing meeting every week? If I could get back even 1 hour a week, what could I tell my manager I'll do with that hour instead? How can I make a case to my manager that I'm going to be able to do something valuable with that hour that is not possible otherwise? So there's always a bit of a negotiation to be had one way or the other.
Cool. So moving on, like we see that a lot of employers are seeing this pushback from the employees after offices are opening back up. So what is the future of work according to you?
Yeah, I mean, my fear is what we're looking at is a bifurcation in the workplace that mirrors a lot of the polarization across lots of other elements of society, which is you have, in effect, a class of knowledge workers who have a disproportionate amount of self-control, self-direction, a disproportionate sense of how valuable their contributions are to their employer. And then you have, in effect, an underclass of workers who have no real sense of what their contribution is, no real sense of self-control or self-direction, and that the gap between those two populations is actually getting wider and wider. And so organizations that are able to build themselves around the self-controlled, self-directed knowledge worker are having now a virtuous cycle of productivity going up, 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 the value of each employee going up, up, up. Innovation improves, performance improves across lots of different dimensions. And the other organizations have got a large population of workers, often service workers, who don't have the benefit of any of those kinds of things. And in effect, these different talent models become different management strategies. And you can start to see organizations where you'd say, I'm not sure that organization really wants their employees to be self-directed. I think they want a low wage, low flexibility, low self-control workforce by design. That's what they want, right? And then you have a bunch of other organizations where you say, man, that organization is doing everything it can to push responsibility out to the individual employee, push control out to the front lines of the organization. And it's not contingent on your business. Costco is one of the oldest businesses in the world in retail. and they are famous for how much control they give their employees. They, relative to the retail business, they pay their employees, quote unquote, they overpay them, is what a lot of Wall Street analysts would say. And yet their economic performance continues to be exceptional year after year after year, because their strategy is based on high value, high compensation employees doing, in some sense, infinitely more than a low value, low compensation workforce could ever do. So these become, in effect, economic strategies, actually. And the future of work, I think, is no one model. It's an ongoing struggle between these models. And Drucker's contribution to this conversation is to see and understand clearly that the latter model, the low contribution, low self-control model, is actually one of the central forces in social decay. That in societies where people at their everyday job don't have a sense of meaning in their work, don't have a sense of control in their work, that actually is one of the fundamental ingredients of social breakdown. That leads to, as Drucker said, that leads to authoritarianism, that leads to tyranny. And that the alternative to that, the functioning societies, as he said, is one in which organizations are well managed. It's not high poetry, but it is human nature. If you have a society where organizations are well managed, the organizations perform, individual employees have a chance to perform and contribute their best, everything else in society becomes stronger as a result. So that's the struggle for each of us as managers, as workers, as volunteers in community organizations, is to ensure the future of work is not preordained. It will be what we make it. And it's to ensure to the best of our abilities that it is the positive future of contribution and self-control.
Wow, this is so good. In my mind, I was thinking, the future possibilities are endless in terms of businesses restructuring the business functions and keeping the self-directed, self-driven functions internal, in-house, yes, and moving out I call them as order takers, or moving out, yes, these service type skill set outside. That way, yes, you still own the IP and you still own the innovation. In some sense, yes, something like what Apple does. In fact, there was yes, there was an article on Apple's organizational structure yesterday in Wall Street Journal, but they talk about, yes, how they have these core business functions intact, the design and the core business functions that drive Apple's products, and then, mm-hmm, maybe manufacturing is all outsourced and they just bring, mm-hmm, that in. And but I think in terms of the knowledge work and knowledge, so do you see like a possibility of what's your idea on a three-day work week instead of a 5-day work week? I know a lot of countries. I was reading 1 or 2 countries where they have this concept, and in fact, I think Twitter or some company, they initiated some idea of a 4-hour work day or something like that. What's your, yes, thought process on that? In terms of being more effective, spending less time, yeah, in doing work and enjoying both parts of life, working and, yeah, yeah, leisure. What do you think about that?
Your question is a great one. I think there are a couple of different ways to look at this. So one is just on an individual basis. Whatever your job is, wherever you work, whatever you want to do, there are, again, these kind of invisible choices we all make around our work that in part your question begins to make visible, which is, well, there are trade-offs in everything in life. And I can work more and make more money and have more professional success and recognition. And there's a lot I like about that. And maybe you'd say at some point, I actually would like to work a little less and make a little less money and have a little less professional notoriety, because there are other reasons why that'll be good for me. I'll be happier, or my health will improve, or I want more time to build a boat, or whatever you're doing, that there are lots of ways to do that. And American culture particularly, our Puritan culture we've inherited, is really geared toward just do more, right? Work more, work harder, make more, be better, that's kind of one of our national narratives. So it's probably used to be an oddball thing. I think the pandemic has actually, again, drawn for a lot of people, drawn this question to the surface. They suddenly realize, hey, I've been at home a lot more. My life's been really different, and some of it's really great. And I want a job that lets me do more of that, even if maybe I'm making less money, but it's okay. I don't need a car anymore, right? Because I'm not commuting anymore, and I'm going to, whatever. I mean, there's lots of changes people may make. So one dimension of that is individual. The other is managerial, as you know, organizationally. What if a company like Twitter or Netflix or someone, right, says we're going to go to a 4-hour workday or something? These things are tricky. Netflix famously has an unlimited vacation policy. And part of what is behind that is the understanding that, again, as a knowledge worker, you know better than anyone else in the company could ever know when you need to be at work and when you don't need to be at work, when you need time to recover and when it's time to, lean in. The problem is that culturally, in an unlimited vacation culture, also it can be unlimited because it's also a very driven culture. Netflix is a very hardworking, very driven culture, as we know from everything that's been written about it. It is extremely meritocratic, right? So it's just understood. People get laid off there all the time, and they get generous layoff packages, and we're just kind of always finding better talent, and that's okay. Don't worry if you're not a great fit, you're fine. So in that kind of culture, you could say unlimited vacation. You couldn't go to your local grocery store employees and say unlimited paid vacation. They just leave and never come back, right? So it works because the Netflix employees kind of know, yeah, I shouldn't just disappear for 2 months, even if I could, right? Even if I said, man, I worked my butt off. We had our product launch. There's not much going on in July and August. I'll see you all after Labor Day. It would be very hard to do culturally. So those decisions, it can sound kind of exciting. Let's move to a 4-hour workday or whatever, right? But of course, you have this problem in law firms already where attorneys may get compensated based on, how many briefs they can produce in a certain amount of time. And then your bonus is tied to whether you can do more briefs in X number of hours. And so an attorney who wants a big bonus will just underreport their hours, right? They'll work 18 hours and they'll say, I only work 12 hours. And then it'll look like their productivity went up. So once you move to you give employees control over where they work, and then you want to start talking about, quote, how long the workday is, I'm not sure you actually have that control anymore as an employer. People will figure out how to work or not work, whatever they think is in their own best interest and whatever the culture expects of them. So that kind of change would have to be made as part of a much larger set of messages to employees about the life we want you to have, the way in which this company is going to thrive and be here for you for the long term, right? You wouldn't want employees to worry, well, geez, if we all only work 4 hours a day, can the company make a profit, right? Or are we suddenly going to go under and then I'm out of a job? So maybe I'm going to keep working hard anyways, I'm worried. Or maybe my manager is not quite all on board with this and still kind of expects me to work 6 or 8 hours and told me just to pause that time tracking app that runs in the background. Pretend I'm going on a lunch break, but just keep working. All these little things can kind of slice up some exciting things like that. I am much more in favor of getting away as much as possible from talking about time and location for work and talking instead about contribution. And if employees are clear what their contribution is, and the manager has thought through, is this contribution doable in a reasonable amount of time, then let people do what they want to do when they want to do it. You want to trust knowledge workers to do high quality work, and you want to trust them to work in the ways that work for them. And a top down, X number of hours per day initiative, I think some people would really be rubbed the wrong way. They might say, well, I want to be in the office 8 hours a day. I need to chat with my coworkers in the break room. That's where I get my ideas. Now you're taking that away from me. Now suddenly you have a bunch of people who are unhappy that they can't work more. So the structure becomes, again, a bit of a distraction from the real underlying conversation. How do people create value, and how do we line up all the value the individuals create in service of some larger goal? Time's only one part of that.
Yeah. I think from my perspective, my advice to anybody who cares about the future of work or their career is more about being more self-aware, and like in Drucker's words, start tracking where they make an impact. instead of, letting their managers tell them, this is what you are doing right and this is what you are not doing right.
Yeah,
so it's
right.
very important. The more self-aware an individual is, and they understand their strengths, and that's how they can start, they can start in their interactions at work with their managers. They can ask for more work, which is aligned with their strengths, instead of just waiting for the next order. So
that's right. That's right. The entire system of OKRs, which is everywhere these days, is grounded in Drucker's, the underlying that was created at Intel, and it came out of Drucker's work on MBO, which is management by objectives. And the idea of MBO, which really got perverted and misused in a lot of companies, the idea of MBO was, if I tell an employee what their objective is, then I can get out of their way and let them do whatever the right thing is for them to do to meet that objective.
Yeah.
In too many companies, it gets turned on its head. And it's, I'll tell you what your objectives are. And if you don't do exactly what I say, then you're doing something wrong, which is completely the opposite of what they're supposed to be. So the idea of all those MBO and OKR systems is they should lead to shorter, more valuable conversations with management that then create a lot more freedom for employees and accountability, both. As an employee, you should feel like my choice about what to do with my time is actually really important. I'm being entrusted to invest my time and expertise in the right ways. My boss doesn't know what those ways are because I'm the one who's doing the work. It's my choice to make. That should be the result of those conversations.
Yeah. So I really enjoy this conversation, and hopefully we might have to do a part 2 of this conversation. And
Sure.
Before I conclude this, people who are listening to you, watching you, how do they find you if they want to talk to you or connect with you?
Yeah, thanks. And likewise, Amo, it's a great conversation. I love terrific questions that we're all thinking about these days. So it's very timely stuff you've raised for your listeners. Anyone who's interested can learn more about our work by just going to our website, www.drucker.institute. And you will find there a wealth of information about our programs, the work that we do that builds on Drucker's work to create, as you said at the opening, new intellectual property, new kinds of products and services that have these principles baked in. There's also quite a bit to learn about Drucker himself on the website. So if you want to find out some things you may not get off his Wikipedia page, there's some great stuff there, as well as some recommendations for things to read and other stuff. So lots of good things going on there, and encourage anyone who wants to come on by our archives. His archives are all digital and freely accessible to the public. So there's a ton of great information available.
Yes, perfect. So this was Zachary First, Executive Director from the Drucker Institute. I thank you so much for your time, Zach, today.
Thank you very much, Amol. I really appreciate it. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you for listening. If you would like to listen to the full episode, go to our YouTube channel or Apple iTunes or Spotify. Go there and search for The Superhuman Project and you will find us. In case you would like to contact us, please follow our LinkedIn page and send us a direct message. Until then, thank you.